Hey y'all, it's Corey here. Today's May 23rd, 2024, and I'm in Philly for Memorial Day weekend. This is my first trip to Philly, and I just got off the plane, dropped my luggage at the hotel, and the first stop I make is to Pat's King of Steaks for the original Philly cheesesteak. Let's see what all the hype's about. Thank you, sir. Alright, so I ordered the American cheesesteak with onions, and this is what it looks like. Man, that roll looks incredible. Beautiful cheesesteak. Alright, let's dig in. Alright, so cheesesteak number 2 from Pat's. This one is Whiz, whereas the first one was American, so we're going to see which one I like better. Okay, so I definitely liked the Cheese Whiz cheesesteak better than the American cheesesteak. So hot take there. And today is Friday, May the 24th, 2024, and I am in the historic city center of Philadelphia at Independence Hall. So I have a 3 p.m. tour with the National Park Service today, and I'm going to try to take you guys along. So let's see the inside of the signing place of the Declaration of Independence. Welcome to Independence Hall, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, May 24th, 2024.
Oh, yeah.
I've recently been watching the Michael Douglas TV series Franklin, and so it's just a little surreal to finally be here in Philadelphia where so much of America's history took place. What a beautiful courtyard. Let's see who the statue is of. John Barry.
Commodore Jack Sparrow.
Curious if we'll learn more about him on the tour of Independence Hall.
Yeah, it would be on record.
Original 292-year-old building. We do ask that there is no eating, drinking, or gum chewing allowed inside. George Washington could have not chewed gum if he tried, so I'll let you think about that one. Feel free to take photos with or without flash. If you're using a smartphone, just make sure it's on silent or vibrate. We're going to be together for 20 minutes. There'll be time for questions at the end of the tour. Take all the pictures you want, as I said, but please do not lean on the walls or the woodwork. That is the original part of the building inside. So when you're ready, you want to follow me.
Step over so you can step out. Yeah, you can go right inside. You just want to spit out your gum in that trash can. Or there's one.
Is video okay?
Yep, video's fine. Can you keep going straight through the archway to the room on the left? The city building is now on federal property. And when we got here, the rooms did not look like this. So we had to do our homework. We discovered that about 90% of the bricks outside are original. 75% of the inside is original. That is the walls that surround us. They scraped off 50 to 60 layers of paint in some places. We got down to the original woodwork. We got really lucky because the oxides for the authentic paint colors are still there. So quick poll, thumbs up if you like this paint color, thumbs down if you don't. All right, sorry, that's like asking your decorative opinions. It does reflect the light nicely though when you don't have electricity, which we do have now because the City Council of Philadelphia was occupying this building, put electricity in. We also have central heating and air conditioning because that's good for us. Probably not going to happen. It didn't happen in this building. We do have one original object in each room, though, in here. It's that painting up there. That is the Pennsylvania coat of arms from 1785. That was in this building. That was in this room. It was painted after the American Revolution is over. So that's essentially the first version of our state seal. This building, though, was built for our colonial government, created by William Penn. It had 3 branches. On the second floor was the governor's office. We are not exploring that space today, but it was invitation only in the 1700s. Across the hallway, that is the room you came to see on the tour. That's where the Declaration of Independence was adopted and signed in the summer of 1776. But that is not the purpose of that room. It is for our elected legislature. That is the Pennsylvania Assembly room. The men in that room pass laws, they pass taxes, they can close and lock the doors. Not everybody is watching what they're doing. Well, you walked into this building, told you to go straight and turn to the left. No one had to open up a second door because this is the judicial branch. This is the Pennsylvania Supreme Court chamber. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court still exists today. There are a appellate court under our system, but before, during, and after the American Revolution, they are also a criminal court for all capital cases. So people would come in and they would be standing where you are right now. You would see judges up here at the judge's bench. Person accused of a crime, they get to have witnesses at their trials. You have your witness stand over here to the left. Under English common law, you get to hire an attorney. That attorney defending you, they're sitting at the same table as the prosecution. That was common during the time. Can still happen today. You also get a right to trial by jury, so we have 3 jury boxes in here. 2 are for the grand jury. This one is for the 12-person jury that is going to decide if the accused is guilty or not guilty. Would anyone care to point where they think that person would be? Yeah. This is a recreation of a prisoner's dock. We don't use these anymore in the United States of America, but they still use them in England, Wales, and other countries. They're typically large enough now so both the accused and their lawyer will be in there together. And in the U.S. we say that you are innocent until proven guilty. So, next poll question, how many of you think you look not guilty standing in a prisoner's dock? All right, I always get 1, thank you. 1 or 2. How many think you look guilty? Yeah, that's the one that usually gets the most hands, which is why you would want your friends, your family, and your neighbors to be able to witness your trial. They are open to the public. In their minds, that's how they're making this process fair. Now, we have been arguing for hundreds of years whether or not we think this process is fair, but that's a different tour. But for the purposes of this tour, if my boss came up to me and said, Sarah, turn the Declaration of Independence into a room, already done. It's this one that we're standing in right now. And you might not think courtrooms when I say Declaration of Independence. Most people think of a phrase that lives at the top of the document, all men are created equal. And that is why Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, Susan B. Anthony, Martin Luther King Jr., Barbara Giddings all visit this space or protest outside this space because they're looking to make that true. 1776, totally different story. We're already a year into the Revolutionary War. It is not a war for independence. The next summer, we're going to declare independence. We're going to create a new country. And we're going to need more than 55 people to make that successful. So the Declaration of Independence is actually to convince other side. And what better way to do that than to blame King George III for 27 things that weren't necessarily all his faults. It is a constitutional monarchy in Britain. But he's their failed representative. So on this list of 27 things, taxes are only mentioned one time. That's it. For all that we hear and learn about this stuff, we're going to blame him for quartering large bodies of troops amongst us. And on this list, half of it is about how he has taken your legal rights by manipulating judges, trials, juries, and courts of law. Because outside of slavery, this is the only thing that is the same to those 55 guys. All of them. He's taken your rights, please be on our side. That's what the Declaration of Independence is for in 1776. So let's go where everything happened, right across the hallway over there. You want to turn around, go through the door, go left, go right, take some photos.
This is incredible. All right, everyone, welcome to the Pennsylvania Assembly Room. This is where the Second Continental Congress started meeting in May of 1775. The Revolutionary War had already started by the time the delegates get here, so they are going to create the Army, the Navy, the Marines in this room. So they are all celebrating their 250th birthday next year. Well, June of 1776, a delegate from Virginia named Richard Henry Lee then proposes that these united colonies have right and ought to be free and independent states. Do we celebrate our Independence Day in June? No.
No. Because they didn't have enough votes for that to pass. So we're going to wait until July. We'll vote on this question then. In the meantime, we are going to have a Declaration of Independence drafted. It is a group project. We have all done group projects before. So if you were the person that had to do all of the writing, you are Thomas Jefferson. John Adams and Benjamin Franklin are his editors. And then Roger Sherman and Robert Livingston get to have credit on the project, but didn't do any of the work this time. So, they work on the Declaration for 17 days. It's completed, it's handed in at the end of June. July 1st and 2nd, we're going to debate the question, do we want to be free and independent states? And on July 2nd of 1776, the answer is yes. So here in the United States of America, we celebrate the wrong day. Independence Day is July 2nd. We only celebrate July 4th because that is the date that made it to the top of the paper people saw. So imagine you are Thomas Jefferson. You handed in what you thought was this amazing paper. So on July 4th, they adopt the Declaration of Independence in this room, and it is their 27 reasons why they want to be the United States of America. So they give it to a printer, John Dunlap, so he can typeset it, and they think he printed anywhere between 100 and 200 copies, of which there are 26 around today. They are distributed to the states, to the Army. They are read out loud. They are posted in public places. They are printed in newspapers. This is what you would have seen. Now, has anyone seen the signed copy in DC? Yeah, a few people. Well, they do sign the Declaration of Independence in this room on August 2nd of 1776. That copy was not for us to look at in a museum. It is not for the king. It was literally for the guys in this room. That is theirs. This is ours. Now, a whole bunch of stuff is going to happen. We're now officially the States of America. Sometimes they call themselves the 13 United States of America. Is that what we say today? We're the 50 United States of America? No. Because in the reality, back then, this is like 13 little countries. We have a diverse cultural background. Now we're going to be independent states. We're going to create our own independent state governments. Some of these state governments are going to continue to print their own money. So we're like 13 little countries united in a common cause. We're going to keep fighting a war. We have no idea if we're going to win. We need a new government. We don't want a king. So, 1776, they're writing another document called the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. They're an interesting read. If you ever want to pick it up, it's not very long. But basically says, we're going to keep having a Congress, check. Every state is represented by multiple delegates. So you could have 7 guys, you could have 3. They get to vote once. One state, one vote. So I hope they got along. Then on top of that, if you want to change the rules, all 13 states have to agree to it. Now that's like asking 13 brothers and sisters to make a unanimous decision. Probably not going to happen. So when the Revolutionary War ends in 1783, this Congress never had the power to tax. They never gave themselves the power to tax because that would require a unanimous vote. So they don't have any money to pay the soldiers who fought in the war. Problem number 2 is the Treaty of Paris now says that the Mississippi River is the West Coast, essentially. So states like Virginia still have the power to just move their border as far as it can go. Georgia's going to do that too. Do you think the other 11 states enjoyed this? Absolutely not. New York and Pennsylvania are going to fight. Virginia and Pennsylvania are going to fight. Connecticut and Pennsylvania are going to fight. So Congress becomes so weak, the delegates stop showing up. So it's decided that in May of 1787, we will have a convention here in this room to try to fix the Articles of Confederation. That did not happen because Rhode Island did not send any delegates. So these guys decide we're going to keep the windows and doors closed. Notes are secret. You can't talk about what is happening in this room with anyone who is not in this room. George Washington is a delegate for Virginia. He is elected to preside over the convention. So he actually sat in this chair up here. This is our only original object from this building in this room. And while George Washington sat up there sometimes, he did not do the talking. This is not his plan. This is not his idea. There's a catch to all this, folks. first off, running out of time. Secondly, they were here for 4 months. James Madison's probably somewhere up in the front here, writing everything down. Then now we have to figure out, well, did he edit the notes? Probably. And they're not made public until after everybody had died. So you can ask them what they meant. What do they talk about? A ton of stuff. But they're going to focus on a plan for a 3-branch national government, national being very scary, with a Supreme Court, a president, and a Congress. And they are going to argue about this plan for 4 months. And on September 17th of 1787, 39 names are now attached to this plan, and it is the United States Constitution. And it's literally wired in a national park right now. The Constitution creates my job. But, that being said, when the Constitution left this room 236 years ago, we have continued to argue about it. Is it perfect? Is it complete? Is always a big question. And these guys argued about it too, but not in the same way because they actually had to write it. So, highlight questions. How many presidents should we have? Because we just have one, not one from each region of the country. So for these guys, that's only 3 or 4 people. What does the president get to do? How old do they have to be? Who picks the president? We still argue about today. Some guys said Congress, some guys said governors, some guys said state legislatures. 2 guys said popular vote, everybody else said no. So one of those guys turns around and says, how about an electoral college? Then, on top of that, it's only for 4 years. Because it could have been 7, 13. They could have went with Alexander Hamilton's plan, which he spent 6 hours presenting. He said you could be the president for the span of your natural life based on good behavior. And they somehow left that out of the musical. The longest debate is, should Congress be 1 house or 2? That went on for 6 weeks. Is it based on the population, or we have equal representation in one? What does Congress get to do? All this stuff. And then on top of that, they're going to argue about immigration. They're going to put in there that only the federal government is allowed to trade and make treaties with indigenous nations. And they most definitely argue about slavery. September 17, 1787, 39 names are attached to the Constitution. It leaves this room for ratification. 236 years later, we still have it. 27 amendments have made it. Out of over 11,000 proposed. Is it perfect? Is it complete? You say no. We were clearly on a super long list of people with past visitors to this building, like Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony, and even one of the signers, Benjamin Franklin. He did not think the Constitution was perfect, but he did have hope for this new republic, which he summarized very nicely. And he talked about the chair. George Washington sat in up there. On the back of that chair, there's a carving of a half-sun. Benjamin Franklin said that during the debates of the Constitution, he would often stare at that sun and he would wonder if it was rising or setting. Benjamin Franklin went up to the desk, he signed the Constitution, and said at length, now I have the happiness to know that this is a rising and not a setting sun. He had hope for this new republic, but I think, and this is my opinion, if you could tell Benjamin Franklin we still have the Constitution today, he would be both pleased and surprised. Signing a document is one thing, using it is another. And that is our job, and it is not an easy thing to do. So folks, thank you for visiting today. If you want to arrange your free photo of this room, this is your last chance. Otherwise, we're going to head out here and to the left. I'll take questions outside and enjoy your time in Philadelphia.
That was incredible. I learned a lot today that I actually didn't know. I'm a huge history buff, a huge patriotic American, as you guys know. If you saw my videos of the US Capitol or Mount Rushmore over the past couple of years. But yeah, I did not know the rising or setting sun on the back of George Washington's chair as described by Ben Franklin. So that was super interesting. It's just really cool to be in the place where our democracy was founded. I think it's definitely something that people should do at least once if they're interested. And in Philadelphia, if you get a chance, visit Independence Hall.
That's insane.
I thought his first name was Barry.
Oh.
Let's go try to check out the Liberty Bell.
That's kind of the thing. Stable. Going to a lot of class, 6,000-8,000 people a day going through. It's kind of hard.
So across the street from Independence Hall, we have the original Liberty Bell, and it's pretty incredible.
We try to get away from a little bit. We try to keep it stable. So we constantly monitor places. Yeah, I have issues with the building, but I like the accessibility back to the It's just a glass building, kind of in the middle of the block. Mostly glass, and just the bell, there's no exhibit. So that was one of the reasons they wanted to have something too. So. But ultimately, the reason they got the first of its own buildings was just so people could see. Because Independence Hall is 292 years old, it can only take so much traffic. Whereas on a busy summer day, we can get, 10,000 people. A lot more people can see it than the first building across the street. We really enjoy talking to all the rangers that are around here. That's why we're here. So are you guys from Wisconsin or just your Green Bay fan? Whereabouts?
All right, y'all, so I finished up my tour of Independence Hall and the Liberty Bell this afternoon, and this evening I am dining at the historic Dante and Luigi's Italian restaurant in Philadelphia. So one of my favorite things about food and restaurants is how they play into the American immigrant story, and Dante and Luigi's is really special in that regard because in the early 1900s, when Italian immigrants were coming from Italy over to the United States, they didn't speak English, and they would come with the address of this restaurant pinned to their lapel, and then they would get jobs and boarding here at the restaurant, and it's still here amazingly 100 years later. So we're gonna check it out tonight, so come along and see how the food is, and if you're in Philadelphia, check out Dante and Luigi's.
Hello, sir.
All that's great. I know, all right, they get things yesterday and you're gonna cherries, and that's fun. It's good. It's nice. I enjoy it. That's great. And that's your piece. And that's where my stuff came from. Well, the brand was. Thank you. The brand was Mucho Mazzo, that name. Xfinity is the same kind
So here we have Dante and Luigi's stuffed calamari, and it has a shrimp and marinara sauce, and it looks incredible.
ABC.
So for the entree tonight, I'm having Dante and Luigi's calf livers, and a very traditional Italian dish that's been on the menu for 124 years. So the calamari was stunning. That was the largest piece of calamari I've ever eaten, and it was stuffed with shrimp, so that was incredible. And these calf livers just look incredible. So the final course at Dante and Luigi's is going to be the Italian rum cake and a cappuccino. What a perfect way to end an incredible meal. I will definitely be coming back for another dinner here as soon as possible.
Unlimited reserve seating in the theater. Well, we can bring that.
Let's get a shot of this real quick.
Thank you so much for coming today. My name is Mary Kate Carey. I'm from Birmingham, Alabama, and I would really like to thank Dr. Leone for allowing my colleague Corey Johnson and I to present with him and his team. We're really grateful for this opportunity today, and excited for you all to see what each of the presenters have to share with us. We're going to hear from Frida Diaz first, and then we'll hear from João Santibanez, and then finally from Corey Johnson. Thank you.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for being here. I'm Frida Diaz, and I will present to you one of the studies of my thesis project titled Studying Interindividual Spatial Dynamics of Behavior Throughout Scales of Reinforcement Based on Continuous Tracking of Organisms. In the experimental analysis of behavior, the interaction between conspecific had been studied as social behavior, which was defined by Skinner as the behavior of two or more people with respect to one another or in concert with respect to a common environment. Traditionally, this behavior has been studied under the schedules of reinforcement, and this paradigm implies the recording of a response of one or both subjects on arbitrary operand fixed in space, such as pressing the lever of the key, the use of separate experimental spaces like two separate operand chambers, the analysis focused on change in the response rate, and the response criteria based on discrete responses. However, the traditional use of scales of reinforcement has not considered study the effects of the schedules over the spatial dimension of behavior in terms of the change in the spatial distribution of the subjects in the same arena, or the incorporation of subjects' movement as a criterion to reinforcement delivery. When Skinner provides his definition of social behavior, he also highlights the relevance of the spatial dimension of social behavior in terms of the stalking interaction between a prey and a predator, in which a prey moves constantly to increase its distance related to the predator, who is also in constant movement to decrease his distance to his prey. But the traditional use of the scales of reinforcement does not allow to study the change in the displacement of the subjects, since it has been constant the isolation between both subjects. This limitation was a result of the technology of the time. Today, it has been developed methods of automatic detection with the support of machine vision technology. In this slide, our lab has been working with this technology, first demonstrating that individual displacement can be affected by its behavioral responses to environmental stimuli, and next, creating a reinforcement scale based on individual displacement facilitated by a real-time tracking system using machine vision. We demonstrate that fixed and variable reinforcement arrangements based on cumulative distance can effectively modify an individual spatial organization. With these findings, our next step was asking about the effects of scales of reinforcement based on the movement of two subjects. In other areas, it has been demonstrated that the distance between subjects is one of the most sensible measures to understand the establishment of different patterns of movement between subjects, like the proximity between them in terms of a decreased distance. However, these studies had few observations. The stimulus delivery occurs once per session, and they do not compare the effects of different stimulus delivery arrangement. So, even if the experimental analysis of behavior it is studied the relation between different scales of reinforcement upon the establishment of social behavior like coordinated response pattern, the spatial dimension of social behavior has been overlooked for the most part. There is only one study that incorporates the distance between subjects in the development of scales of reinforcement. In 2019, Kuroda studied the effects of a scale of reinforcement based on the distance between two zebrafish on the response rate. In his study, the author exposed 4 pairs of zebrafish to an aquarium segmented into compartments, one for each fish. At first, he exposed each dia to an extinction phase without programmed events. Next, to a phase of variable time 30 seconds program. The experimental phase was exposed to a fixed rate 1 scale, whose criterion for deliberate reinforcement was that both subjects were a distance of 1.5 centimeters in the middle of the arena in the top. And the last phase was a variable time jog program to the interval between deliveries. The effects of the programs were evaluated from change in response counts across the phases. In his results, Kuroda reported that in 2 of the 4 dias, it was possible to identify an effect of increasing approach responses under the contingent program, in comparison with the non-contingent programs in which a decrease in the response rate was observed. Although Kuroda's experiments involved a first approach in the study of inter-individual behavior in its spatial dimension, his work used an analysis centered in the change over the approach response rate, discretized the distance between subjects without considering its sensibility to being altered and reorganized by the different stimulus delivery arrangement. Also, he used the experimental spaces to restrict physical interaction between the fish, as each subject was kept in one compartment of the aquarium. Therefore, the purpose of the present work was to study the inter-individual spatial dynamics under contingent schedules of fixed distance between subjects in a situation without physical restriction. We used 6 male Wistar rats on the 23-hour water deprivation schedule, and we exposed them in dias to a 100 by 100 centimeters arena with 2 water dispensers under the floor. At the moment in which the dispensers were activated, each of them stuck off the ground, allowing access to the water. The 3 pairs of rats were exposed at first to a baseline situation without any programmed events during 3 sessions. Later, the dias were exposed to a schedule of reinforcement based on the distance between subjects for 20 sessions. When the program registers that the distance between subjects was 15 centimeters, the water dispensers were activated for 3 seconds. At the end of the delivery, the dispensers were disabled. And for the last, the rats were exposed to a variable time jog schedule to the interval between deliveries of the last 5 sessions on the fixed distance scale. In this phase, the delivery values were different for each pair of rats, and it lasted 10 sessions. The number of sessions were fixed for all phases, since this experiment is part of a series of studies, and each session was conducted 1 per day. The displacement of each subject was recorded throughout the 20 minutes of each session, and derived from their displacement, we obtained the frequency of the average responses, that is, the record of instance in which the subjects meet the distance criterion at 50 centimeters, and the average distance between subjects across the phases. At first, I will show you the frequency of average responses, and it is the close measure to the standard analysis in the field. This figure shows the frequency of average responses across sessions for all conditions upon the 3 dias. In each panel, the data of each of the dias is shown, and the tendency line is marked with a red line. For the three dias, it was found that in the baseline, the number of average responses ranged between 50 and 60, and the tendency was stable in 2 of the 3 dias. When the dias were exposed to the fixed distance between subjects scheduled, in the first session, in the change of phase, in 2 of the dias, the number of responses was higher in comparison with the previous sessions. And in the next sessions, the number of responses increased for the 3 dias gradually throughout the sessions, reaching between 18 and 120 responses in the last sessions. Across the phase, the tendency to increase the number of responses from the first session stands out, and we observe a variability in the values of the number of responses. For the duration to the baseline from the first session, the number of responses decreased for the 3 dias, remaining at lower values compared to the previous phases, and the tendency decreased during the 5 sessions. In the variable time jog schedule, the first session, the number of responses increased notably compared to the immediate previous sessions in 2 dias. However, in the following sessions, the number of responses decreased to levels like the previous phase, and the tendency decreases. It is important to highlight that the variability in the number of responses in the baseline and the variable time jog schedule was lower in comparison with the fixed distance between subject schedule, since the value remains constant across each phase. Considering this data alone, we can say that inter-individual spatial behavior is sensitive to the contingent schedule, as evidenced by an increase in proximity patterns. In contrast, both baseline and variable time jog schedule show the same effect, a reduction in proximity between conspecific. However, our approach suggests that this conclusion might not be entirely accurate, as the discrete recording of responses does not allow us to study potentially differences in inter-individual spatial behavior under the baseline and the variable time jog conditions. Nor does it provide insight into how subjects move across sessions. With the mean distance between subjects, we can observe that even if the subjects were exposed to a variable time jog schedule, the inter-individual spatial organization is different. In a similar format to the previous figure, here we show the mean distance between subjects throughout the experiment for the 3 dias. In the baseline phase in 2 dias, it was observed that the mean distance between subjects ranged between 15 and 60 centimeters with established tendency, while in a pair of rats, the distance decreased. When the subjects were exposed to the fixed distance between subjects schedule, in the first session of the change of phase, in 2 dias, the mean distance decreased. In the rest of the experiment, in the 3 pairs of rats, the mean distance between subjects decreased to values between 35 and 15 centimeters for the last session. A tendency to decrease the mean distance was observed from the first sessions. It is noticed that in 2 dias, the variability in the values of the distance was reduced at the end of the phase. In the relation to the baseline from the first session of phase change, an increase in the average distance was observed, and the average distance between subjects ranged between 15 and 60 centimeters in the rest of the experiment. The tendency was stable in 2 of the dias, meanwhile in the other increased. In the variable time jog phase, in the first session of the change of phase, in 2 dias, the value of the mean distance increased, and in the rest of the phase, the tendency decreased. It is highlighted that the values of the mean distance were higher than in the previous phases, between 16 and 17 centimeters in the 3 dias. We can observe that the mean distance between subjects is sensible not only to the contingencies of reinforcement under a schedule based on the distance between subjects, but also is sensible to schedules independent of this criterion. The purpose of this experiment was to study inter-individual spatial dynamics under contingent programs of fixed distance between subjects in a situation with a physical restriction. As a discussion of this work, it is that inter-individual spatial behavior is sensitive to reinforcement contingencies under schedules based on the distance between conspecific, as evidenced by a greater number of average responses and a lower average inter-individual distance observed under the contingent schedule. This demonstrates that the proximity response can be used as an operant response to study inter-individual spatial dynamics under reinforcement schedules. The effects of reinforcement schedules based on the distance between subjects were consistent across the 3 dias used in this experiment. This result differs from what was reported in the study by Kuroda, where only 2 or 4 pairs of subjects meet the stability criterion during the phase of the program contingent on average responses. The differences in our results compared to Roda's experiment might be due to procedural differences, such as the type of device used, the arbitrariness of response criteria, and the species differences. Our study represents an advance in understanding the dynamics of special inter-individual behavior made possible by incorporating a machine vision technology. This technology has allowed us to develop tools to study inter-individual spatial dynamics by observing change and organization in the spatial distribution of subjects and incorporating the movement of subjects as a criterion for the delivery of reinforcement. Our work was not without limitations. One was the number of sessions in the first phase of baseline. This could affect the sessions of the change of phase to the fixed distance scheduled between subjects. A second limitation is the lack of a second reversal to the fixed distance schedule. However, our design includes both intra-subject and inter-subject controls. These limitations should be considered in future work under this paradigm. Potential improvements include incorporating a quantification of the variation in displacement between subjects in terms of the entropy of distance between conspecifics, and developing a reinforcement schedule based on the variable distance between subjects with values derived from the data obtained in the present study. Thank you.
Hello everyone. So I will present my work titled Analyzing Inspection Patterns Enable Two-Dimensional Transposition Task for Studying Human Relational Behavior. And in this talk, my purpose will be to show you the relevance of behavior in perceptual learning processes. In behavioral science, the study of perception of stimulus relations in humans has been widely studied with different perceptual tasks. For example, matching sample tasks or transposition tasks, which involve different functions of stimulus relations, like same different relations or more or less same relations. Because of technological developments, computerized tasks using digital screens have become an increasingly affordable option for conducting experiments that have had several facilities to analyze behavior, but in other areas rather than behavioral science. So, for example, in areas like the human-computer interaction, the tracking of cursor of mouse movement has been a very affordable option to analyze human behavior in artificial environments. On the other hand, in cognitive science, the analysis of mouse movement has led to focus on derived behavioral patterns as a kind of correlates or expressions of mental processes. This sort of perspective suggests that behavioral patterns are just reactions controlled by some hypothetical structure. So what about behavioral science? Despite these technological advancements, like the mouse movement analysis, these resources have barely been adapted and incorporated in the study of perception of stimulus relations. However, in the case of the transposition area, the situation has changed in recent years, where the mouse movement analysis is seen as part of active behavior that subjects employ and has very important implications for the perception area. That the way subjects behave is the way they perceive. So in transposition area, relational behavior as a kind of discrimination learning is understood as the ability to identify and respond to stimulus relations based on the relative properties, regardless of their absolute ones, like choosing a bigger glass for a beer, or those that are darker in color than others, regardless of their specific size or color. So an object could be bigger than or darker than only in comparison to other objects. This relational behavior has been systematically studied by the traditional transposition task. Basic research using this task has typically involved training subjects to respond to a relational criterion based on the comparison of a pair of stimuli that vary in one or more dimensions, such as bigger or darker than, for example. The assessment focuses on measuring the increase in correct responses and the decrease in response latencies, which are the primary empirical evidence of relational behavior. However, while the standard transposition task allows us to demonstrate that subjects respond to relative properties, this approach has been criticized in two ways. The simple stimuli arrangement doesn't allow the study of other properties relevant in our natural environment, like distance between objects, for example. And it focuses mainly on correct responses and latencies, neglecting the role of behavioral active patterns and leading to assume that comparison occurs in mind. Recently, Leon and collaborators found that in a modified stimuli arrangement divided in 3 zones, mouse movement over the screen was critical to inspect stimuli in order to respond correctly. This pointed out 3 things. That active patterns are critical in relational behavior, that this behavior has spatial dynamics that could be further assessed, and that this spatial dynamics is sensitive to the stimuli arrangement. This last point leads us to consider the influence that other properties could have on relational behavior and its spatial dynamics. In this line, we could think about a spatial property, like distance, for example, which is relevant in our natural environment and could emphasize the need for a more complex stimuli arrangements. But the spatial property hasn't been studied in transposition area, and it's important because in our natural environment, objects are constantly changing their position, which consequently turns movement crucial as it enables contact with different objects. And because our natural environment is multidimensional, it is common to engage with objects based on more than one of their relative properties, in which distance is one of them. So, for example, in the cinema, we tend to choose seats farther from the screen precisely because of their size. If it weren't for size, distance wouldn't matter. So, in order to study and explore how active patterns were affected by distance as a relevant dimension, but together with other dimensions, the purpose of this first study was to analyze the effect of 2 multidimensional relational criteria, size distance versus saturation distance, on the number of required trials, latencies, and spatial dynamics of course of movement in a relational behavior task among adult humans. To do this, we designed an experimental task in which 3 stimuli continuum were made: distance of circles with respect to a line, size of the lines, and saturation of the lines. All 3 of them were composed of 6 different values, respectively. And with them, 2 multidimensional arrangements were made: size distance and saturation distance. Both always have 6 circles that vary in distance and 2 lines in which arrangements differ. In the first, the lines only vary in size, and in the second, they only vary in saturation. So the goal of the task was to choose the correct circle according to the relational criteria. In the size distance arrangement, the correct response was a farther circle with regard to the bigger line, and in saturation distance, the correct response was a farther circle with regard to the darker line. 14 adult humans between 21 and 28 years old volunteered to participate in the present study. Sessions were performed were conducted by remote control using Crop Desktop Remote. Experimental tasks included mouse movement recording trial by trial. 2 groups of 7 subjects each were conformed. Both groups were exposed to 6 sessions of 18 corrective trials, up to 5 additional trials, with positive feedback, and then exposed to a single test session with 18 non-corrective trials without feedback. Besides the traditional measures, we introduced novel measures in the area that capture active patterns relevant to relational behavior based on mouse movement: the straightness index and velocity entropy. The straightness index was used as a measure of mouse movement directionality and was calculated by dividing the straight line distance from the start to the end of the point of the trajectory by the total distance traveled. And apart from the variation in course of movement concerning its directionality, there could be differences that are not observable at first glance. In this regard, we revisit Shannon's entropy as a measure of variability in cursor speed. To do this, taking the cursor speed frame by frame, it was discretized into 10 bins, and then entropy was calculated using the speed in each of the bins as a reference. So, higher entropy indicates greater variation in cursor speed along all the trials of the experiment, and lower entropy indicates less variation in cursor movement speed throughout each trials. So to present the results, I plot the lowest regression for the sample moving averages of 5 periods in order to smooth the noise of the data and capture the general tendency along all the experimental trials. First, I will show the plots for the traditional measures and then those for the spatial dynamics measures to see how the last ones complement the first ones. Here we see the lowest regression for the number of trials required to respond correctly in training, in which blue and red lines correspond to size distance and saturation distance group respectively, and gray bands represent the confidence interval. We observe that subjects from the saturation distance group needed more trials to identify the correct response in training, took longer to respond in the initial sessions, but what's more interesting is that they moved the mouse in a more seamless manner and had less variation in the changes of velocity throughout the experimental trials. So these results together show that the straightness index and velocity entropy as measures of the spatial dynamics of mouse movement allow us to appreciate differences in the active patterns involved in relational behavior, depending on the multidimensional arrangements to which participants were exposed. These behavioral differences cannot be seen with the traditional measures. So these findings revealed that there were differences in relational behavior, not only in discrete responses and latencies, but also in the mouse movement. That is, analysis of mouse movements led to distinct inspection patterns under different conditions. And according to the findings, saturation in a multidimensional arrangement seems to demand different inspection in order to identify the correct stimuli. Besides, more trials are required to respond correctly. This is interesting because the literature with the standard transposition test reports that saturation delays the relational behavior establishment. So we propose to know more about the role of saturation in a multidimensional arrangement on relational behavior establishment and its spatial dynamics, and decided to conduct a second experiment similar to the first one, but now included the variation of saturation of the circles as irrelevant for the relational criteria. With this, we wanted to see how saturation affects relational behavior when it's included in the stimuli arrangement, but when it has nothing to do with the correct response. As main hypothesis, we expected that it would have more effect on saturation distance group. So the arrangements have the same structure as in the first experiment, with the correct response being the same for each arrangement. However, only the variation of circle saturation was included, although it was always irrelevant for determining the correct response. The experimental design was exactly the same as in the first experiment, with 2 groups of 7 subjects each, and also the procedure was the same. For results, the straightness index and velocity entropy were also analyzed. So in this second experiment, showing the lowest regression of simple moving average, we observed that saturation distance group needed more trials to respond correctly, took a bit longer time to respond with almost no difference, and more curiously, the effect in the straightness index was inverted. Now, subjects of saturation distance group moved the mouse straighter than size distance group, and the variation in the changes of velocity were strongly different from size distance group throughout experimental trials. So again, straightness index and velocity entropy show differences in active patterns involved in relational behavior. In conclusions, the proposed task allowed for the study of relational behavior where distance was part of the comparison criterion as part of the multidimensional arrangement. In the second experiment, standard measures suggest that it was more difficult to identify the correct circle, since we observe a higher number of trials to respond correctly. These results support the hypothesis that saturation makes it more difficult to establish relational behavior regardless if it was relevant or irrelevant to respond correctly. Straightness index and velocity entropy show significant differences in active patterns between groups, but these robust differences in active patterns were found in the spatial dynamics and not in the temporal ones, suggesting that the more complex the stimuli arrangement, the more informative are spatial dynamics about behavior than the temporal ones, which has been one of the main empirical evidence for the relational behavior. In this sense, we could say that spatial dynamics measures fill behavioral gaps that cannot be appreciated with the temporal ones. But these active patterns could have not been addressed without the facilities provided by tracking systems. Present findings support the relevance that current technology has in the basic study of perception of stimulus relations with a very behavioral perspective, and that expands the scope of the dimensions of behavior to be studied, particularly the spatial dimension. But of course, it is important to know some of the limitations of the present studies. Noise was introduced into the mouse movement data because the starting point of the mouse was not controlled at the beginning of each trial. And second, it was employed a 5 frames per second rate to track mouse movement. This rate implies a lower amount of data per second, which could difficult the incorporation of other measures, which requires a higher rate of data, for example, angular velocity. While our spatial dynamics measures are robust to these limitations, they should be addressed. Additionally, future experiments could involve incorporating circle size as an irrelevant dimension to further study its effect upon relational behavior, and replicating the present 2 experiments using a counterbalance group designs, as it could strengthen their current findings. And this is all. Thank you, everyone.
So far, our presenters have discussed research conducted with human and non-human animal participants in a laboratory setting. Glenwood's research team is investigating methods of programming discrimination of movements by an artificial intelligence camera to facilitate automated behavior data collection in human participants. Research discussed in this presentation was made possible through a generous donation from the Susan Mott Webb Charitable Trust. As many of us know, technology is great, until it's not. What happens to automated behavior data collection systems when buildings experience power outages? Why can AI not discriminate crosswalks from stairs and those annoying captchas that Google asked us to complete to verify that we're human? This poem by Shel Silverstein summarizes some of the frustrations we experience with technology, and in this context, artificial intelligence on a daily basis. The homework machine, oh the homework machine, the most perfect contraption that's ever been seen. Just put in your homework, then drop in a dime, snap on the switch, and in 10 seconds time, your homework comes out quick and clean as can be. Here it is, 9 plus 4, and the answer is 3. 3, oh me, I guess it's not as perfect as I thought it would be. The genesis of this research question, can we train AI cameras to count maladaptive behaviors in learners with autism, came from an unlikely place. The idea of a typical Friday night changes greatly from your late 20s to your late 30s. Currently, my idea of a perfect Friday night consists of stopping at Target to pick up a pint of Ben & Jerry's on my way home from work and watching Netflix on my couch. One such Friday evening, I was in the self-checkout line at Target and noticed an image similar to the one of a television monitor above my head. I became interested in the video recording technology used to detect and prevent shoplifting in supermarkets and how we could adapt this technology to track behaviors like head-directed self-injury in learners with profound autism. Notice the red detection window in the photo on the left, which signals an anomaly. In this case, a shopper placing an item in his or her jacket without purchasing it, while the green box indicates a shopper holding up an item and visually inspecting it for typical supermarket behavior. Here you see an example of the behavior data sheets we use in schools for students with autism, and other developmental disabilities. Behavior frequency data is collected for individuals with a diagnosis of autism or intellectual disability to monitor progress and inform decision-making by the behavior analyst. Vollmer and colleagues in 2008 discussed how this data impacts critical life decisions, such as residential placement, psychotropic medication, psychiatric prescriptions, and restrictive procedures outlined in behavior support plans. This highlights the need for accurate and reliable data collection, which staff suffered to collect accurately, as Mozingo and colleagues demonstrated in their 2006 JAMA article. We looked at a study on the use of AI cameras to detect sleep disturbance by Lesser and colleagues, published in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis in 2019 for methods to generalize AI data collection from shoplifting and sleep disturbance to head-directed self-injury. Lesser and colleagues set up cameras to automatically record when motion during sleep occurred. Researchers were 79% more efficient at scoring sleep disturbance when using motion detection cameras compared to scoring continuous video. Think of one video clip as a partial interval recording. We don't know if 1 or 10 motor movements occurred during the video clip without watching it on hand scoring. This image shows different camera settings for the yellow detection windows to optimize motion detection. In the Lesser and colleagues study, all movement during sleep was recorded. However, I argue that all movement during sleep does not constitute sleep disturbance. Results in the Lesser study showed that motion detection underestimated sleep disturbance, as indicated by the aggregate error bars falling below the continuous video data recording levels. Not surprising given the analogy toward partial interval recording. Here we see body parts along the y-axis and percentage of intervals where motion detection along the x-axis. In the study conducted by Lesser and colleagues, one goal was to compare the data collection efficacy of the motion detection camera to that of human data collectors. Their control group consisted of a no movement condition where the camera was expected to record no video clips as no movement occurred. We are extending the study by Lesser and colleagues by asking what camera software and filter modifications need to be made to improve fidelity of motion detection and data collection. From the Axis P1344 camera used in the 2019 study by Lesser and colleagues to the Axis P1375E camera that we employed in this study, users have already seen improvements and upgrades to the ability to employ multiple detection windows per video frame. How do we teach the AI camera to discriminate between socially significant and non-significant movements? We start by defining the breakpoint for what ranges of motion the camera will and will not detect. As a supervisor, I've had direct care staff working with a child with autism ask me, when the child gets upset, do you want me to count or block for behavior? Unfortunately, the answer is currently both. However, it's not realistic for us to expect direct care staff to be able to do both with fidelity. This line of research could remedy this problem by teaching a camera to count discrete instances of hand-to-head directed self-injury while ignoring topographically similar behaviors, such as nose scratching. This improvement in data collection would free up staff time and energy to implement antecedent and response strategies to keep the learner safe without the added burden of collecting data during a behavior crisis. All hand-to-head directed arm movements are not maladaptive. For instance, nose scratching serves a function. We begin our study by asking if the camera can record gross motor movements while ignoring fine motor movements. It's important to note that edits to the camera software may be required to achieve the terminal goal. Participants to this point in the study have consisted of Confederates, or typically developing adults, who volunteer and consent to research participation. Each session is approximately 1 hour in duration. The research space is an office with an AI camera positioned 3 feet in front of the participant and the researcher behind the camera. The researcher prompts the participant to make alternating gross or fine motor movements and hand scores the movements that occur and if the camera records the movement or not. The researcher gives a pre-trial prompt for the participant to get ready in the ready position for the next motor movement. Then the researcher waits for the camera to terminate recording before giving a verbal SD indicating which fine or gross motor movement the participant should perform. The photograph on the left is an example of the camera ignoring a fine motor movement, which is what researchers expect to occur. This is indicated by the absence of a red dot recording symbol on the top right of the camera software Axis Camera Station window. The image on the right is an example of a gross motor movement which the camera records, which is also expected behavior, and this is indicated by the presence of a red dot in the top right of the Axis Camera Station window. Each trial ends when the camera ceases to record the participant's movement, or 5 seconds after the movement ends if no recording is triggered. The researcher waits for the offset of recording before prompting the participant's next movement. A total of 218 trials across 3 pairs of gross and fine motor movements were conducted. Due to storage constraints and privacy, each video clip was automatically deleted from the computer software after 14 days. For each trial, the researcher hand scores the data sheet which contains these fields. Data collection for the dependent variable in our study is captured in the column on the data sheet labeled camera recorded ? While data for the independent variable in the study is captured in the columns labeling motion detection cameras filter settings. The control condition in our experiment is indicated by human data collection of the behavior topography that occurred, be it gross or fine motor movements. Camera filter settings, number and size of detection windows, and distance from the camera have remained constant for data collection to date. Researchers moved to the next pair of fine and gross motor movements after 40 trials if the percent of false positives and false negatives were less than 10%. Here we have a photograph of a false positive which occurred when the camera recorded a fine motor movement as indicated by the red dot in the box during a movement that should have been ignored. Next, we have a photograph of a false negative indicated by the lack of a red dot during a gross motor movement that should have been recorded. Here we see the data from our study to date. On the y-axis, you see the fine and gross motor movement pairs, while the x-axis depicts the percent of occurrences in which the camera recorded the movements. The black bars represent gross motor movements, while the striped bars represent fine motor movements. Notice that it took more trials to reach mastery criteria for the false positives in the first motor movement pair. Likewise, it also took more trials to reach mastery criteria for false negatives in the first motor movement pair. This is in part due to the researchers learning the camera's confounds and how to minimize setting events that lead to false negatives or positive results, such as windows being open where the camera can see traffic on the street outside, or the research participant wearing loose jewelry or sleeves which trigger recordings during fine motor movements, which the camera should otherwise have ignored. Before AI motion detection cameras can be successfully used to calculate total count for behaviors like head-directed self-injury, we must determine what camera software and filter modifications need to be made to reduce the offset of camera recording, among other variables. So what did we learn in our study? First, we learned that the camera can reliably discriminate between gross and fine motor movements given its current settings. We also learned that false positives are more likely than false negatives, that visual noise is a barrier to accurate and reliable data collection, that auditory noise also contributes to longer inter-trial intervals, and perhaps most importantly, that you don't need to be a computer programmer to investigate AI camera recording. For next steps, we intend to collect IOA data for gross and fine motor movement pairs, to alter camera filter settings and evaluate change in percent of false positive and negatives on the same 3 motor movement pairs. We intend to employ accelerometers to identify what the speed and velocity breakpoints are for detecting motor movements by the camera. Answering these questions will help future researchers approach a closer approximation of automated behavior data collection. Thank you.
Thank you. We do have a couple minutes for questions, if anyone has any for any of our presenters today. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question for the AI camera. So, because, it's supposed to be artificial intelligence and machine learning, so I'm curious to know if, at what point
question for Corey.
So it's important to note that the software we're using is not a machine learning software, so it is not learning from what the input we're giving it. We're not providing the camera with feedback. However, we are evaluating what modifications to the filter settings on the camera make it more likely for us to be able to automate the behavior data collection.
So, that's really good to know. So with that camera, so what part of it is like the AI capable with it? I guess I'm a little bit confused about that.
Yeah, so I think Dr. Mark Bonova does a good job of defining AI in a sense that it's something that completes a task by a computer that humans are currently better at. And so humans are currently better at behavior data collection than the camera is, and so that's how we conceptualize it as artificial intelligence. Are there any other questions related to the camera study?
With the IO8 data collection, that would be the humans collecting the data?
Yeah, so we have one human data collector currently, and so we're going to add a second human data collector just to, because we're deleting the video files after 14 days due to storage constraints and privacy issues. We just want to demonstrate that there is consistency in the data collection so that it's documented. Anyone else?
Hi, I just wanted to add a comment, not really a question. I think this was such a wonderful presentation on AI. This is my first time coming to ABAI as well, so to see something that everyone is using with AI, whether it's Grammarly or there's some other app, I just want to say thank you for presenting this. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Our goal is to make it more approachable, certainly, so appreciate it. Thank you all.
Any other questions today? Okay, thank you for coming. Have a wonderful conference.